The Nexus Trading Hub was not the kind of place where anyone wanted to stay longer than necessary, and it floated in the darkness of space like a rusted metal tumor orbiting a dying red star at the very edge of what civilized species called known territory. This was where the unwanted came, and this was where deals happened in shadows, and this was where the strong crushed the weak. Without anyone asking questions or caring about the answers, hundreds of species moved through its corridors every single day, and they came from worlds so different that their bodies looked like nightmares to each other, and yet they all understood one universal truth about this place. Power was everything and weakness was death. Kira Vasquez did not belong here, and anyone with eyes could see that simple fact written across her entire being like a warning sign that screamed easy target in every known language across the galaxy. She was human, and that meant she came from a small blue planet called Earth in a quiet corner of the Milky Way that most species had never even heard of until maybe 50 years ago, when humanity finally figured out how to travel between the stars. She stood about 5 feet and 6 inches tall with dark brown hair, tied back in a messy ponytail and skin that showed the tan of someone who had spent too many hours working under artificial lights on ships that never saw real sunlight. Her clothes were worn and practical and consisted of cargo pants with too many pockets and a jacket that had been patched so many times it looked like a map of her struggles, and boots that had walked across a dozen different worlds without complaint. She carried no visible weapons, and she wore no armor, and she had no energy shields shimmering beneath her skin, and she showed no signs of the genetic modifications or cybernetic enhancements that most spacefaring species considered absolutely essential for survival. She looked soft, and she looked weak, and she looked like exactly the kind of person who would not survive 5 minutes in a place like the Nexus Trading Hub. And that was exactly why Graphax noticed her the moment she walked into the waiting area near Transport Gate 7. Graphax was a Torvak, and his species had earned a reputation across the galaxy as the muscle you hired when you wanted problems to disappear and people to stop asking questions. He stood 7 feet tall, and his body was covered in a chitinous hide that had evolved to withstand the crushing pressures of his homeworld, and it was scarred from 100 bar fights across a dozen different star systems. His eyes were small and black and set deep in a face that looked like someone had carved it from stone with a dull blade, and his arms were thick enough to crush industrial equipment, and his hands ended in fingers that could punch through starship plating without breaking. He had killed members of 30 different species in his long career, and he had never once felt anything resembling fear or hesitation or mercy. Behind him stood 2 members of his crew, and they were not Torvak, but they were loyal, and they were dangerous, and they were always hungry for entertainment that involved watching weaker beings suffer. The 3 of them had been waiting at this gate for 6 hours because their ship needed repairs, and they were bored in the way the predators get bored when they have not hunted anything in too long, and then the human walked. Graphax had heard stories about humans and their homeworld, and he had heard other species whisper about something called a death world, and he had heard rumors that these soft pink creatures were somehow dangerous despite looking like they would break if you breathed on them too hard. He did not believe any of it. He had seen humans before in passing, and they had always scurried away from him like frightened animals, and they had never once shown any sign of the legendary ferocity that the stories claimed they possessed. This one would be no different. Kira found an empty seat near the window, and she sat down and she pulled out a small tablet and she began reading something while she waited for her transport to arrive. She was going home after 3 months of contract work on a mining frigate, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than her bones, and she just wanted to get on the ship and sleep until she could see Earth again. She did not notice the Torvak watching her, and she did not notice his crew spreading out to block the exits, and she did not notice the other travelers in the waiting area quietly getting up and leaving because they recognized the signs of what was about to happen. Grathax stood up, and he walked toward her with the slow, confident stride of a predator who knew that his prey had nowhere to run. He stopped directly in front of her, and he cast a shadow over her that blocked out the light, and he waited for her to look up. She did not look up. She kept reading her tablet as if he was not even there, and that made something hot and angry twist in his chest, because he was not used to being ignored. He reached down and he grabbed the tablet from her hands, and he crushed it in his fist like it was made of paper, and the pieces fell to the floor like metal rain. Now she looked up. Her eyes were brown and tired, and they showed no fear, and that made him even angrier, because everything was supposed to be afraid of him. "You are in my seat," he said, and his voice was a deep rumble that had made grown warriors weep. Kira looked at the empty waiting area around them, and she looked at the dozens of empty seats, and she looked back at him, and she said, "I am standing now. That is the problem." Grathax replied, and his crew laughed behind him with that wet clicking sound their species made when they found something amusing. She stood there, facing him, and she was so small compared to his massive frame, and she looked so fragile that he could probably break her with one hand and not even try hard. This was going to be fun. The other travelers had all fled by now, and the security cameras in this section had mysteriously stopped working about 10 minutes ago, because Grathax always made sure to take care of such details before he had his entertainment. No witnesses meant no consequences. "I have heard stories about your kind," Grathax said as he stepped closer to her until she had to crane her neck to look at his face. "I have heard that humans come from a death world, and that you are predators, and that you are dangerous." He leaned down until his scarred face was inches from hers. "I think those stories are lies." Kira said nothing, and she did not step back, and she did not show any sign of the terror he expected, and that was the most insulting thing of all. No one had ever faced him without showing fear. It was time to teach this human a lesson about her proper place in the galaxy, and that place was beneath his. Boot begging for a quick death that he would not give her. His fist rose and her eyes tracked it, and still she did not move. This would be over quickly. Grathax did not believe in warnings, and he did not believe in giving his victims time to prepare, and he did not believe in anything except the pure joy of violence. Delivered without mercy, his fist came down like a hammer falling from the sky. The blow was fast and it was brutal, and it carried enough force behind it to crack the armor plating on a military transport vehicle, and it connected with the side of Kira's face with a sound. Like thunder, she went down hard. Her body hit the metal floor of the waiting area, and she slid backward, and she lay there motionless, while Grathax stood over her with satisfaction spreading through his chest like warm liquid. His crew made their clicking laugh again, and one of them said something in their native language that translated roughly to, "Not much of a death world predator after all." Grathax agreed completely, reached down, and he grabbed her by the collar of her worn jacket, and he lifted her off the ground like she weighed nothing at all, and her feet dangled in the air as he brought her face up to his level. Her head hung limp and her eyes were closed, and blood was running from a cut on her cheek, where his knuckles had split the skin. "Humans." He spat the word like it was poison on his tongue. "They say your world breeds monsters, and they say your planet is covered in predators that would make other species run screaming. And they say your gravity crushes weaklings before they can even learn to crawl." He shook her body and her head rolled back and forth like a puppet with cut strings. "They say you evolved alongside creatures with teeth like knives and claws like swords, and they say you killed them all and wore their skins as trophies." His crew moved closer to watch because they enjoyed these moments when their leader educated lesser beings about reality. "They call your planet a death world, and they say it with fear in their voices like it means something special and dangerous." He pulled her closer until her face was inches from his own. "I think it is all lies and propaganda and fairy tales that your kind invented to make yourselves feel important in a galaxy. that does not care about you at all. He was about to continue his speech when something changed. He felt it before he saw it, and it was like the temperature in the room had dropped by 50 degrees in a single heartbeat, and suddenly every instinct in his body was screaming at him that something was wrong. Kira's eyes opened. They were brown just like before, but they were also completely different, and the change was so profound that Grathax actually stopped talking for the first time in his entire life. Her pupils had dilated until they were almost entirely black, and they were focused on him with an intensity that made his ancient predator brain send warning signals flooding through his nervous system. There was something swimming in the depths of those eyes, and it was something old and something terrible, and it was looking at him like he was prey. His crew noticed it too, and they stopped laughing and they stopped clicking, and they just stood there frozen, because none of them had ever seen anything like this before. The human who had looked so soft and weak and fragile just moments ago was gone, and in her place was something else entirely. Kira's hand moved, and it moved fast, and it closed around his wrist with a grip that felt like industrial machinery locking into plastic. Grathax tried to shake her off, and he could not, and that was impossible because he was strong enough to lift cargo containers, and she was just a small human female who weighed maybe 60 kilograms at most. He tried harder, and his muscles strained, and still her grip did not budge. Then she started to squeeze. Pressure was impossible, and it was unreal, and it kept building with every passing moment, like she had hydraulic pumps hidden inside her small human hands. His chitinous hide was supposed to be able to withstand almost anything, and it was rated to survive industrial accidents and atmospheric pressure changes and impacts that would kill members of most other species. It started to crack. The sound was horrible, and it was the sound of his own body breaking under force that should not exist, and he could feel the fractures spreading through his exoskeleton like spiderwebs made of agony. "What are you doing?" he managed to say, and his voice had changed, and it was higher now, and there was something in it that he had not felt since he was a child hiding from storms on his homeworld. Fear. Her feet touched the ground, and she did not drop, and she landed, and the deck plating beneath her boots groaned with the impact, like she suddenly weighed 10 times more than she should. She was still holding his wrist, and she was still squeezing, and the cracks were spreading, and the pain was becoming unbearable. Her lips moved, and she spoke, and her voice was quiet and calm, and that made it so much worse. "You wanted to know about humans," she said. "Let me show you." She twisted her hand. His wrist did not just break, and it did not just fracture, and it did not just crack, it shattered. The sound was like someone had dropped a bag of glass onto concrete, and the pieces of his chitinous armor exploded outward in a spray of fragments, and the flesh beneath tore, and the tendons snapped, and his hand went completely limp. Grathax screamed. It was a sound he had never made before in his entire life, and it was the sound of absolute agony and disbelief combined into one horrible noise that echoed through the empty waiting area. He dropped her because he could not hold her anymore, because his hand no longer worked, and he stumbled backward, clutching the ruin of his wrist to his chest. Blood was pouring from the wound, and it was purple, because that was the color of Torvik blood, and it was pooling on the floor beneath him. "How?" he gasped. "How is this possible?" Kira stood there looking at him, and her eyes were still those terrible focused predator eyes, and there was no mercy in them, and there was no hesitation, and there was only the cold calculation of a hunter deciding how to proceed with a kill. His crew finally moved, and they drew their weapons, and they pointed them at her, and their hands were shaking because they had seen what she had just done to their leader. "Stay back," one of them shouted. "Stay back, or we will shoot." Kira looked at them, and she smiled, and the smile did not reach her eyes. And it was the smile of something that had evolved on a world where death was around every corner, and survival meant being willing to become the most dangerous thing in any room. "No," she said, "you will not." And then she moved. The first second began when Kira's body exploded into motion, and it was like watching a coiled spring release all of its stored energy at once. She crossed the distance between herself and the first crew member before he could even process that. She was moving, and his weapon was still pointed at where she had been standing. A heartbeat ago. His species was called the Vrethki, and they were known for their quick reflexes, and they came from a low-gravity world where speed was survival. He was slow compared to her. Her hand caught his wrist, and she redirected his weapon away from her body, and the shot he managed to squeeze off burned a hole in the ceiling instead of in her chest. The second saw her twist his arm at an angle. That arms were never meant to bend, and the joint made a wet popping sound as it dislocated, and the weapon fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers. She did not stop moving, and she did not pause to admire her work, and she was already spinning toward her next target. The third second brought her into contact with the second crew member, and this one was bigger and meaner looking, and he had thrown aside his ranged weapon in favor of a blade that hummed with energy. He swung at her, and the blade cut through the air where her head had been a fraction of a moment earlier. She had ducked under the swing with a movement that looked almost lazy and relaxed, but was actually the product of millions of years of evolutionary pressure that had turned her ancestors into the most efficient killers on a planet full of killers. The fourth second ended with her palm striking his throat. The impact was not particularly hard by her standards, but the Vrethki species kept their primary breathing apparatus in their necks, and they were extremely vulnerable to strikes in that area. He dropped like someone had cut his strings, and he lay on the ground gasping and choking, and trying to remember how to breathe. The fifth second was for the first crew member, who was still conscious despite his ruined arm and was trying to reach his fallen weapon with his remaining good hand. Kira's boot came down on his fingers, and she pressed, and the bones cracked, and she kept pressing until he screamed and forgot all about the weapon. The sixth second she spent looking at Grathax. He was still standing, and he was still clutching his shattered wrist, and his face was a mask of pain and disbelief and growing terror. She walked toward him with steady, unhurried steps like a predator who knew her prey had nowhere left to run. The seventh second, he tried to hit her with his remaining good hand. It was a desperate swing, and it was clumsy, and it was slow compared to the blow that had knocked her down at the start of this encounter. She caught his fist in her palm, and she stopped it cold, and the impact made a sound like a thunderclap, but she did not move, and she did not even seem to notice the force behind it. The eighth second she returned the favor. Her forehead slammed into his face with all the power her body could generate, and the humans called this move a headbutt. And it was one of the oldest and most brutal techniques her species had ever developed. Grathax had never experienced anything like it. His face was supposed to be nearly indestructible, and his chitinous armor was supposed to protect him from impacts that would kill lesser beings. Her skull cracked through it like it was made of paper. The ninth second he flew backward. The force of the blow sent him sailing through the air, and he hit the wall behind him. And the wall was made of reinforced metal, designed to withstand the stresses of space travel. The wall lost. He went through it in an explosion of debris and sparks and broken conduits, and he landed in the corridor beyond amid a shower of destruction. The 10th second, Kira walked through the hole she had made. She stepped over the rubble without looking down, and she moved toward where Grathax lay, in a heap of broken armor and leaking purple blood, and she did not hurry, because there was no need to hurry. He was not going anywhere. Around them, the station's alarms were starting to wail, and somewhere in the distance, voices were shouting, and the sound of running feet was echoing through the metal corridors. None of it mattered. Grathax looked up at her, and his eyes were wide and glassy with shock and pain, and a terror so profound it had stripped away everything else that made him who he was. He had been a warrior, and he had been a killer, and he had been feared across a dozen star systems. Now he was just meat lying at the feet of something that his brain Could not fully comprehend, Kira reached down and her hand wrapped around his throat, and she lifted him off the ground with one arm like he weighed nothing at all. His feet dangled in the air just as hers had dangled when he held her up only moments ago. But there was a difference. When he had held her, there had been cruelty in his eyes, and amusement, and the lazy satisfaction of a predator playing with helpless prey. When she held him, there was nothing. Her eyes were empty and cold, and they looked at him like he was already dead, and his body just had not figured it out yet. "You wanted to know about humans," she said, and her voice was quiet and steady and completely without emotion. "You wanted to know about death worlds." She tightened her grip just enough to remind him that she could end his life with a single squeeze. "Let me tell you a story about the planet I come from." He could not speak and he could barely breathe, and all he could do was hang there and listen as this small, fragile-looking creature from a backwater world explained to him exactly how wrong he had been about everything. His crew lay behind her, broken and beaten, and they had not even slowed her down 10 seconds. That was all it had taken, 10 seconds to destroy everything Grathax had ever believed about his place in the universe, 10 seconds to teach him that some prey bites back, 10 seconds to break him completely. Kira held the Torvak against the wall with one hand wrapped around his throat, and she could feel his pulse racing beneath her. Fingers like a frightened animal trying to escape from a trap. He was heavy, and he was dense, and he was built from biological materials that were supposed to be nearly indestructible. She held him like he was made of feathers. "You wanted to know about Earth," she said, and her voice was calm and measured, like she was giving a lecture instead of deciding whether to let him live or die. "You wanted to know why they call it a death world." He made a choking sound that might have been words if he had enough air in his lungs to form them properly. She loosened her grip just enough to let him breathe and speak. "Please." He managed to gasp, and the word came out broken and desperate and soaked in fear. "Please comes later," Kira said. "First you listen and you learn, and then maybe you get to beg." Behind her, the 2 crew members were still lying where they had fallen, and one of them was unconscious, and the other was curled up in a ball holding his ruined arm and whimpering like a wounded animal. The station's alarms were still wailing, but no security teams had arrived yet, and Kira suspected they would not arrive until this was over, because places like the Nexus Trading Hub had learned long ago that interfering in certain kinds of business was bad for everyone involved. She focused on Grathax, and she began to speak. "My planet has a gravitational pull that would crush members of most species if they tried to walk on its surface," she said. "We call it 1G, and we evolved to survive it and to thrive in it and to run and jump and fight in conditions that would kill you in minutes." His eyes were locked on hers, and he could not look away. "Our atmosphere is made of oxygen, and oxygen is corrosive and reactive, and it rusts metal and burns organic matter, and we breathe it every single moment of every single day without even thinking about it." She shifted her grip slightly, and he flinched like she had stabbed him. "Our water is a universal solvent that can dissolve almost any substance given enough time, and it covers most of our planet's surface, and we swim in it for fun, and we fill our bodies with it to survive." The fear in his eyes was growing with every word she spoke. "Our sun bombards us with radiation that causes our cells to mutate and die, and we call this sunlight, and we lay in it because it feels good against our skin." She smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Our world is covered with volcanoes that spew molten rock, and earthquakes that crack the ground open, and hurricanes that level entire cities, and tsunamis that drown everything in their path." Grathax was trembling now, and the trembling was getting worse. "We did not evolve on a garden world or a paradise or a safe haven where life was easy and resources were plentiful," Kira continued. "We evolved on a battlefield where everything was trying to kill us from the moment we were born until the moment we died." She leaned closer until her face was inches from his. "And we won." Her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. We evolved alongside predators with teeth like daggers and claws that could tear through flesh and bone. And we were smaller and weaker and slower than almost all of them. She tightened her grip just slightly. So we became smarter and more vicious and more persistent than anything else on the planet, and we hunted them down one by one, and we killed them, and we ate them, and we wore their skins, and we made tools from their bones. Graphax made a sound that was halfway between a whimper and a moan. We invented fire because the darkness was dangerous, and then we invented weapons because our hands were not deadly enough, and then we invented war because sometimes the most dangerous predator on our world was each other. She pulled back slightly and looked at him with something that might have been pity. If it was not so cold, do you understand what that means? She asked. Do you understand what it takes to survive on a planet where your own species is the greatest threat you will ever face? He did not answer because he could not answer because his mind was too busy drowning in terror. It means we evolved to be suspicious and paranoid and ready to fight at any moment. Kira said, it means we developed reflexes and instincts and capabilities that your species cannot even imagine because you never needed them. She released his throat, and he dropped to the ground in a heap of broken armor and shattered pride. Our muscles are designed to operate in crushing gravity, and they are far stronger than they need to be for daily tasks. She said, looking down at him. Our bones are dense and heavy, and they heal stronger after they break, and we break them all the time. He was crawling away from her now, and she let him go because there was nowhere for him to escape. Our blood carries oxygen so efficiently that we can keep fighting long after our bodies should have shut down from exhaustion. She continued, our pain tolerance is so high that we can operate through injuries that would incapacitate members of other species. She followed him slowly as he dragged himself across the floor, leaving a trail of purple blood behind him. We produce adrenaline when we are threatened, and it makes us faster and stronger and more dangerous than we normally are. She said, we call it the fight or flight response, and for most humans, flight is never the first choice. He hit the wall, and he could not go any further, and he pressed himself against it like he was trying to phase through the metal and escape. Kira stopped in front of him, and she looked down at the creature who had attacked her without provocation, just because he thought he could. You called those stories about Earth lies and propaganda. She said, you thought we were weak because we look soft and fragile compared to species like yours. She crouched down so they were at eye level. You were wrong. Her voice was still calm and quiet, and that was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. Every human you have ever seen was holding back. She said, every single one of us learned from childhood how to control our strength and restrain our instincts, because if we did not, we would tear each other apart. She reached out and she grabbed his chin, and she forced him to look into her eyes. What you saw tonight was me letting go. She said, what you saw tonight was what happens when a human stops pretending to be civilized. The terror in his eyes had reached a point beyond words, and I was being gentle. Graphax had been a warrior for over 40 standard years, and he had faced enemies across a dozen star systems, and he had killed more beings than he could remember, and he had never once in all that time felt what he was feeling now. He was broken. Not just his body, which was a ruin of cracked armor and torn flesh and leaking purple blood, but his spirit and his pride and everything that had made him who he was. This small creature from a backwater world had dismantled him in 10 seconds. And then she had explained to him exactly why she was able to do it. And now he understood that everything he had ever believed about his place in the universe was wrong. He had thought he was a predator. He was not. He was prey that had never met a real predator until tonight. Please, he said, and the word came out as a broken whisper. Please, I am sorry, and I was wrong, and I should never have touched you. Kira looked down at him, and her eyes were still those terrible focused predator eyes, but there was something else in them now, and it might have been something close to humanity returning to the surface. Say that again. She said, "I was wrong." Grathax repeated, and his voice cracked with desperation. "I was wrong about humans, and I was wrong about your world, and I was wrong to attack you. And I am sorry." She stood there for a long moment, and she seemed to be thinking about something, and he could not read her expression, and he did not know if he was going to live or die in the next few seconds. "Please," he said one more time, "please show mercy." The word hung in the air between them, and it was a word that Grathax had never spoken to anyone in his entire adult life, and it tasted like ash on his tongue. But he meant it with every fiber of his being. Kira's expression changed. The cold, empty look faded from her eyes, and something warmer took its place, and she straightened up, and she took a step backward, and she looked at him like she was seeing him for the first time. "Mercy," she said, and she seemed to be testing the word. "You want mercy from me?" "Yes," he gasped. "Please, yes." She was silent for another long moment, and then she nodded once. "Okay." She turned away from him, and she walked over to where her jacket had fallen during the fight, and she picked it up, and she dusted it off, and she put it back on like nothing had happened. "Here is what is going to happen," she said without looking at him. "You are going to take your crew, and you are going to leave this station, and you are going to spread a message to everyone. You know." He nodded frantically, even though she was not looking at him. "The message is this," she continued as she straightened her collar. "When you see a human, you walk the other way, and you do not speak to them, and you do not touch them, and you do not even look at them for too long." She turned back to face him, and her eyes were normal now and tired and human. "We are not here to conquer your galaxy," she said. "We are not here to prove anything to anyone, and we are not here to show off how dangerous we are." She walked toward the hole in the wall that led back to the waiting area. "We just want to go home and see our families and live our lives in peace," she said. "Most of us will never hurt anyone unless we are forced to, and most of us just want to get through the day without any trouble." She stopped at the edge of the hole, and she looked back at him one last time. "But if you or anyone else ever touches one of us again," she said, and her voice dropped to something cold and hard, "if you ever hurt another human because you think we are weak and easy targets." She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Grathax understood perfectly. She stepped through the hole and she disappeared from view, and he heard her footsteps fading away as she walked back toward the transport gate. He lay there on the floor, surrounded by debris and destruction and the broken bodies of his crew, and he stared at the ceiling. And he thought about everything that had just happened. The station security finally arrived about 10 minutes later, and they found him still lying there. And they asked him what had happened, and he told them he had fallen down some stairs. They did not believe him, but they also did not ask any more questions, because that was how things worked on the Nexus Trading Hub. 3 days later, Grathax left the station with his crew, and they headed for the inner systems, and everywhere they went, they told the story of what had happened. They told other species about the human girl who had looked so weak and fragile and soft. They told them about how she had destroyed a Torvak warrior in 10 seconds without breaking a sweat. They told them about death worlds and gravity and oxygen and predator instincts and all the other things that made humans so much more dangerous than they appeared. The story spread like fire through dry grass. It reached the trade lanes within days, and the inner systems within weeks, and the core worlds within months. Species who had never heard of Earth learned its name, and they learned to fear it. Not because humans were conquerors or tyrants or monsters, but because they were survivors. They had clawed their way up from the mud of a world that wanted them dead, and they had spread to the stars. And they had done it all while looking soft and harmless and completely unthreatening. And now the galaxy knew the truth. Do not corner a human. Do not threaten a human. Do not ever make a human feel like they need to stop holding back, because when a human lets go of their civilized restraints and reaches down into the ancient predator that lies in their DNA, the result is swift and brutal and utterly without mercy. Kira Vasquez made it to her transport on time, and she found a window seat, and she ordered a coffee, and she watched the stars slide past as the ship headed for Earth. She did not think about Grathax or his crew or the fight in the waiting area. She thought about her family, and her home, and the blue sky, and the green grass, and all the things she had missed during her 3 months away. She was just a normal human going home after a long trip. That was all, and somewhere behind her story was spreading across the galaxy, a warning disguised as a tale, a reminder to every species that had ever looked at a human and seen easy prey. Humanity was not the strongest species in the galaxy, and they were not the smartest, and they were not the most advanced or the most numerous. They were just the ones you did not want to corner, because on Earth, they had a saying. It was not the size of the dog in the fight. It was the size of the fight in the dog, and humans were all fight.